Give me a second to clip this on, if I may. Okay, so there's a tendency when you're a type designer and you're constantly looking at letters to really focus on these tiny little details all the time, and just you take pleasure in them, which is why we do it. But I want to step back a little bit today and really talk about the life cycle of typefaces. And in this case, the way typefaces have been a crucial part of the life cycle of a really, really trusted brand that has been nurtured by its use of typography for decades and decades now. The Times has been around for a long time, but I want to step back to 1930 when Stanley Morrison, who is the typographic advisor for Monotype, wrote a pretty blistering critique to the publishers of the Times of London newspaper about the way that they used typography in the newspaper, saying that there's an authority and a respectability to the newspaper that was being betrayed by the way they used sort of old-fashioned typefaces that didn't show off the quality of the printing presses for the paper, and that were a little sort of too old-fashioned for paper that, while conscious of its history, always prided itself on being up to date. And Morrison made a lot of recommendations about these typographic qualities that could really enhance what the paper was about and sort of support the feeling of the paper in a way that went beyond just the printed word within the paper, but to have the whole spirit and the visual tone of the paper carry the message at the same time. Essentially, branding, which is not something that was talked about in typographic terms very much in those days. So, to get a sense of really what the Times was about in a way that's as true today as it was in 1930 when Morrison attacked this problem, the Times has been around for a very, very long time. In some form or another, it's been around since 1785, and it really prides itself on being the newspaper of record for the UK. They place a lot of emphasis on their objectivity, their independence from which way the political winds blow, and about being a respected source that people can go to for finding out what's going on in the world. And they're very conscious of their legacy and this position that they've had, but at the same time, they don't want to feel tied to history. They want to be just actively engaged with what's going on in the modern world. So the story typographically that we're looking at today really goes from the day that the old Times, was swept away and a brand new type family created by Monotype under Morrison's direction was introduced for all aspects of the paper, along with a crisp modern masthead. And this sense of having a connection to history while being crisp and modern resulted in Times New Roman, which I think, particularly here in the States, a lot of people don't always necessarily get that Times New Roman gets its name from the Times newspaper. It was their new typeface. Now, after the introduction of the typeface, Times New Roman, for the paper, Times New Roman was wildly successful. It was a success for the Times for the period when it was in their exclusive property. And once Monotype was able to introduce it for other customers and for other type manufacturers, it became wildly successful for everyone else. And it can be argued, and I think from many perspectives, that the ubiquity of Times New Roman today in its many forms for many uses in many media is a brand that is bigger than even the Times newspaper, perhaps. So the Times newspaper, however, did not just tie itself to this one typeface and assume that was it was going to solve all problems forever on. The newspaper has evolved over time, and periodically they felt the need to actually update their typefaces to address different problems that came up. I shouldn't say different problems that came up, but a changing situation and a changing context for the newspaper. These are airplanes, aren't they? So there have been these periods where there were big shifts in the format of the newspaper or the technology that was driving how the newspaper was printed and typeset that called for looking at this problem once again. How can the newspaper work with typefaces that show it off in its best light? And here's a quick rundown of the major shifts that have happened over time. And this quick animation just shows that for all these changes in these different families, they share a certain DNA. There's a certain tone that comes through in all of these typefaces that's still true to what the Times is about. A certain crispness, a certain authority. And this brings us to the final example is Times Modern, which is what I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today. These typefaces are an integral part of a newspaper. There's a sense when you work on designing a typeface that you manipulate these small details that are reinforced over and over again as letters repeat and shapes repeat to produce this cumulative effect of what a type design is really about. Very similar to what happens with a newspaper design. All of these different variables about what happens in a newspaper layout change day to day. They can tweak it as they go along. New situations arise, new problems are addressed. And so the paper has changed over time, but they want to maintain this connection. They want to maintain this sense of who they are. So where we're at today at the Times, and their use of typography, goes back to this pretty major redesign that was done in 2006 by Neville Brody's Research Studios. One of the big elements that was introduced in this redesign, the paper had already been experimenting with this smaller format, and they felt that the proportions of the typefaces they had been using, the Times Classic family, were not quite right for this format. So with this big redesign, Neville Brody and Luke Prowse, who's the designer working with him, came up with a brand new family for all the headlines, sort of the signifiers that people saw first in the paper and saw the most of. These are used for article headlines, navigation, signposting throughout the paper, and the new masthead drew from these same designs. And this design really was about distilling some of these qualities in the typographic program of the paper, reducing the details into their most basic forms, clarifying them, making them crisper, making sure that things were legible while being a little bit more condensed and a little bit sharper, and really coming up with a sharp new tone that took advantage of the quality of the newspaper printing once again, but still had this connection to a certain historical form that they could work with. Now, this worked pretty well for the Times once again, and after a few months of working with this new design and getting to understand how it behaved and what the issues were, they came to Monotype to expand the family and come up with a wider range of typefaces based on this design that could be used to address different situations in the papers and new design opportunities, and everything that is part of a modern newspaper brand, which is not just a newspaper, but everything else that goes along with it. So Robin Nicholas and Patrick Gisson and Alice Savoie at Monotype worked on this family of typefaces that took from those original concepts and went in new directions, particularly with extreme ranges of weights for display work and adding italics once and for all, which hadn't existed in the original set.